there a motion to open the meeting?
It's recording now. Okay, we're set.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Is there a motion to open the meeting?
I make a motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
All in favor signify by saying aye or show of hands.
Aye.
The motion is carried. The meeting is open. First order of business is discussion of the minutes of February 11th, 2021. Brian, thank you for getting those minutes to us. You did a great job. Very sensitive meeting with Mayor Tom Murphy there, and there were a lot of very subtle comments and observations to record, and you did an excellent job.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I'm sorry they were so late. I'll try to get them earlier next time. It's hard when the link isn't up by the weekend. It's hard to do it during the week.
Brian, it read like a novel.
Thank you.
Can we, have you all had a chance to look at the minutes, or should we put off till next week a discussion on the minutes? What are your thoughts?
I haven't had a chance to look at them yet.
Okay, so why don't we table that and pick up the approval of the minutes for next week. I would like to introduce as the next agenda item the inquiry from Mr. Jaschensky, the PBA head. He emailed us last night, or emailed me last night, and I sent this morning to you his questions, and later in the afternoon I sent to you my suggested reply. Have you had an opportunity to read both the questions and my draft reply?
I have, and I need my memory refreshed, so I apologize. On his first question, why are we excluding the Board of Trustees?
We excluded the Board of Trustees, my recollection was because we doubted whether our code of ethics could suspend the term of office of an elected public official.
I can answer that question. It has to be done by an individual filing a lawsuit.
Okay,
Oh,
All right. So
not that I'm advocating that.
but so then my question becomes, what's the recourse, for lack of a better word, if a member of the Board of Trustees does not submit the disclosure form? Because they are in decision-making positions.
my guess, Ellen, would be that someone would have to file an Article 78 proceeding.
Yeah, but Dan, that's probably what has to happen, but I think we could recommend a step prior to that and just a public notification that that's not happening, right?
That
Yeah.
what's happening, Mike.
I don't think it should go hidden until somebody makes an Article 78. I think it should be clear that, you know, the following individuals, and maybe we don't just limit that to the board, but the following individuals are delinquent. You know, this is a public filing. They're going to be required to file, and that, you know, the following individuals have failed to submit their documentation. They're in violation of this section.
Okay. Well, we can certainly take it up. I think it's something we do need to take up, but I think, Nora, you have answered at least in the affirmative the first question, and that is, or my reply, at least inferentially, that we do not have the power to suspend an elected official from office.
No, I think somebody who could answer this question really quickly might be John Mancini.
And he is the village attorney?
He's the attorney at NICOM who does all the ethics. That's his area of expertise.
Okay, I don't know that he will respond to an inquiry from our committee.
I'm sorry. I think we already did ask him for something.
He will.
Oh, he will? Okay. Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So I think he's a very good resource. So if he doesn't have the answer, then there's more research, but this is his real area of expertise.
All right, I will make that inquiry of him. I believe I've been in touch with him before. Okay. Well, with that in mind, what I would then, I'll revise my reply in that question to Mr. Dashensky by stating that we were uncertain as to the power of the board of a Board of Ethics in so doing, and that we will inquire accordingly.
Okay,
And on his second question, where the second question was that regarding, it states that the Board of Trustees will establish a list of those required to complete disclosure forms. I noticed that your committee has not yet addressed this. Why is there not a prescribed list specified in the code? What is the criteria used to establish this list, and does it remain the same from year to year, or does it change? And my reply was, actually, this is a section of the code which we have been discussing at almost every meeting. We consider it important. You are correct. We have not redrafted the section, but we plan to make recommendations to make this section more relevant and workable. With my suggested change in the answer to the first question and that second question, what are you? Go ahead,
I
Mike.
think it's perfect. No, I just cannot drag this out. I mean, I would recommend we send this. I mean, I think it touches the bases. I'm good.
Everyone else?
Yeah,
yep,
me
I'm
too.
good.
I thought it was good.
All right, I will reply accordingly. And just as a side note, based upon, in part, our discussion with Tom Murphy last week, personally, I don't know that we'll take it up tonight, but personally, I think we are in the 21st century. There should be a way to file these disclosure statements online and affirm the truth of them. There are legal proceedings, execution of wills, trusts, documents, land transfers that are going on now that are done electronically online via Zoom meetings. For our village of 16, 17,000, I don't see why we can't accept and institute an electronic filing for these statements. But to be discussed.
Dan, if I could offer, I mean, my feeling is we've just had enough discussion on this. I think you're 100% right. I just, I would move forward that we, make that recommendation to the board, that something along that line be drawn up, and we just take that off our list of things we have to address because it keeps growing. So I think it's a good idea, and I think it should be done.
Great, thanks. Now I'm looking for my document. Sorry, let me try that again. Looking for my Word document. Oop, maybe it's. Ay. Why do I? That's just my email. I need my. Sorry, folks. Share screen. Why am I getting just? Can you guys see anything?
You?
Just me.
Yep.
That can't be a great sight.
Oh, come on.
I'm trying to find my Word document. I'm getting my emails. I'm getting my. I'm just not getting. Sorry, I'm doing share screen, and usually I get my Word documents up, and I have a Word document poised to. That's the Word document ready to go, but I can't find it. Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. Sorry for the delay on that. What I'd like to do now is go back to our consideration of the sections from basically from where we left off. And what I'd like to do is start where's my cursor? All right, page 4. And my 21.4B1A, what I've done there as per our agreement, I've revised the section deleting the restriction of the prohibition against abuse of discretion to just professionally licensed persons. I've taken that out and made it unrestricted. And now we haven't looked at this in now almost 2 months, I think. So, but this is, I believe, what we agreed to. Unless there's any further comment or any disagreement on that. If not, I'm going to go to page 13.
Wait, can you go back to that?
I can.
I'm stuck on my favorite subject, the who.
Okay.
I think that left out consultants.
Um,
Was that by design?
let me see. Specific village officers and employees' responsibility. All are prohibited from knowingly exercise any discretion in any matter of village interest. No, I don't see any reason to not include consultants. So let me plug that in.
I agree, and Dan, if I can, just thinking out loud about when we've talked earlier about definitions, should we make sure that what we mean by consultant is anybody who might have that similar type role? You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Although might come in under a different name or title.
Let's see.
You mean like a temporary employee, Mike?
Whoever would be serving in the capacity of a consultant, whatever we call that animal, right? That I don't want somebody to say, oh, it's not a consultant, it's this.
So maybe we,
I don't know how
my
know how
last
we do
place, the last place of employment I had, which was an investment bank, we used the term contractor, which covered consultants, any temporary.
We have a definition here.
Yep.
Mike, you can't see it, I take it.
I can't see it right now, and
Yeah.
I'm okay, and I apologize for not being able to see it. I want to make sure that when we get to these definitions, because I've heard in the past that that's a problem, I just want to make it as all encompassing as possible, and that there's no wiggle room there to say the person isn't a consultant.
We have a definition that says any individual, group, or firm which renders services on behalf of the village to any village officer, board of trustees, planning board, board of appeals, or any other village agency or commission. So that's in there. When you get a chance, take a look at that and see if it covers what you think should be covered. And now that I'm looking at it, I'm going to drop village from the definitions. So because unless it says village consultant throughout, it probably is, there's a little defect in that, but I'll just make it consultant unless there's another reason comes up. but I think we've addressed it, Mike. So when you get a chance, take a look at it.
Will do.
Okay. So thanks for that, Ellen. Let's go to back to page, page 13. Where am I? Okay. 1321 7D. I've subdivided this section from the very large paragraph it was into what I think are logical separate sections. And under 2, D2, it says no ethics board member shall be employed by, or shall be, in the original language, shall be employed or act as a lobbyist. Okay, this is to me, a very large boulder to trip on, because we do not define lobbyist in the code. And that to me can be a fatal flaw. So what I am suggesting is to delete the word lobbyist, and instead use the verb appear, which we use in other parts of the code. If not, we will have to define lobbyist. And the definition of lobbyist in various New York State statutes is very, very extensive. It's long, it's complicated, it's defined as it's defined. And I think we'll wind up with a section or definition that is, I think, not necessary for a village ethics law. I think we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here by substituting and using a word that we use in the same context elsewhere. Any comments, thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I don't know that we need to use the word lobbyist.
Well, as I said, as it is constituted now, as it is written now, I think we fall into something of a quagmire that would require us, if it is contested, to revert to other laws and then figure out which law applies, because we don't define it in the code. So any other comments on that? If not, I will make the change and put it in suggested as part of our draft. Then the next question in this is, do we need to be broader than the village of Mamaroneck, town of Rye, or town of Mamaroneck? We may have discussed this before, but I don't remember exactly. Should we prohibit an ethics board of ethics member, from acting or appearing before any before any board outside of these 3 areas? Should we prohibit them generally, or just confine it to Mamaroneck, Rye?
Dan, I go back, and I believe I stated this earlier, that I understand the Mamaroneck Rye component now because that's where the village sits. But if that is important, then, should they sit in a county or state position, assuming the same logic, is that it overlaps our village, right? So if they're prohibited from sitting or doing something with Rye or Mamaroneck, why wouldn't we extend that to the county and or the state?
Any other views on that, please?
I mean, sometimes I think it's like maybe too broad too. Like if you say the state, what if it has nothing to do with Mamaroneck, but it's about like social issues that have like nothing to do with like municipal law? So I think sometimes like we have to avoid making it too broad. Like I don't want to be like no ethics board member can have a job. Like I think it's too broad. I think what we have is fine. I don't think we need to extend it to the county or the state.
I agree with
But
you, Brian.
Brian, if I could just offer, because I have a different opinion, I'm sorry to interrupt. Couldn't the same thing apply in the town of Rye with something that was taking place in Portchester or Rye Brook?
I mean, possibly, I guess, because like Portchester just dissolved their court, so that will have like some impact on Mamaroneck taxpayers. So I guess that's possible.
I hear what you're saying, and certainly the county and the state are much, broader options there. But I just look at it, if the intent was to say, because the town of Rye and the town of Mamaroneck are the key components to the village of Mamaroneck, well, there are other components also. So it just seems like if we do it, then we do it the whole way or don't do it at all. It's just, we're in this middle area here. And that's the part that I think everybody here knows. I kind of like very concrete and defined statements.
Yeah, I can't clearly articulate examples or think of examples where someone on the Board of Ethics would be lobbying in Erie County about something that relates to Mamaroneck. I think my gut instinct is that we should broaden it but restrict it to the county.
Right, but
I could live with that.
except we're also saying no ethics board members shall be employed by. So we're basically saying that you can't work for the county and be on the ethics board.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Or,
That's my objection to broadening the scope.
Yeah.
or my thing is if you put a comma after by and after act, so it should read, no ethics board member shall be employed by comma or act comma as a lobbyist. So the employed by and act as a lobbyist should be together. Because like if you're saying no county employee can be on the ethics board, then you just eliminated a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's the and or combination. I think that's critical there.
Yeah, commas matter.
So how would you change it to get into what you were proposing, Brian?
I would just put a comma after by and a comma after act.
No ethics board members shall be employed by or act as a.
Because like if the town of Rye wants to hire a lobbyist for something.
We're changing this now. No.
Right, so what's the wording we're gonna use
No.
without lobbyist?
No ethics board member who is employed by, no ethics board member shall appear before any of these entities as part of their employment. No ethics board member shall appear as part of his or her employment before the village of Mamaroneck, the town of Rye, or the town of Mamaroneck. Well, as part of their employment. In other words, what you're then saying is that
Yep.
No, a member of the Board of Ethics cannot, regardless of who they're employed by, appear before the village or the town.
Sorry, I think what we have now is actually limiting because it excludes people who are like, on a hypothetical, could be like the town of Rye wants to lobby the state, and that lobbyist is on the board of ethics, which isn't allowed currently. But if we put it to what is in the brackets, that would be allowed.
Right, but Brian, what's the risk if someone's employed by the town of Rye and is appearing before the state? What's the risk? Sorry, don't mean to put you on the spot like
No,
that.
no, it's a good question. It's just it kind of gets like too murky, I feel like.
Let's go back to what our intent is here. What is the intent of the section? I think it is to assure that a member of the Board of Ethics does not appear as in effect, what we know a lobbyist to do, or to advocate a cause for and be paid for it before the village, the board, trustees, the land use, so that there would not be a conflict between their role on the Board of Ethics and the cause that is being advanced by their employer or by someone who they were, or to prevent them from being hired for that purpose.
Okay, but wait a minute. So to get to Brian's concern, maybe this should be 2 points. No ethics board member shall be employed by the village of Mamaroneck, the town of Rye, or the town of Mamaroneck, period. And then we have no ethics board member shall appear as part of his or her employment before the village of Mamaroneck, town of Rye, or the town of Mamaroneck. Separate the two things.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And now thinking about it on second thought, like I don't see why. Like, I mean, clearly a person employed by the village of Mamaroneck couldn't be on the ethics board as it stands now. That would be like a huge conflict.
Yeah.
So if we split this into 2 separate things, I think we're okay.
I think you got it, Ellen.
It took us how many meetings on this one?
A lot.
Yep.
Hey, not a
Mike, are you okay with that?
I'm okay. I hear the will of our the other members. Yeah, I'm good.
All right.
All right. Okay. So we go on to page 17.
You skipped,
Oh, you're right. You're right. I did.
we had the party registration stuff, and I know we discussed that at length at the last meeting, but if I remember correctly, that came up with Tom. That came up last week, so
Yeah, here we are. No, that's not it.
no, it was in the same section. It was right below what we just discussed.
All right, let me go back there.
Keep going.
I think it was like page 15 or something.
Yeah. Keep going.
And I put page numbers on my notes. I thought I had done it all. I guess I didn't.
Oh, 13, 14.
Okay, yeah. Number 6.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay, so what I've done here is a Board of Ethics member changing their party registration will have to notify the Board of Ethics and the Board of Trustees in writing. A change in registration constituting an impermissible party imbalance will result in a vacator of office unless cured within 10 days. That's what I've done.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Any other views on that? I think it's consistent with what we discussed.
Yep.
It is, Dan, I just didn't hear the one word you said, unless it's what in 10 days?
Cured, Mike. In other words, unless the,
Okay, cured, I'm sorry. I just couldn't, I didn't hear that word.
yeah,
That's the word we use, just in a different language. I always say renounced. I'm good with that.
okay. And the language in the section itself, Mike, is in the event a member of the board changes their party registration, they shall inform the Board of Ethics and the Board of Trustees in writing within 48 hours of the change of registration. If the result of the change of registration is that more than 2 members of the board are registered in the same political party, the change of registration shall constitute a vacator of office on the date the change of registration took place, unless the change of registration is revoked within 10 days. So the word cured is just descriptive. I actually use the word revoked in the language.
All right, so I'm being anal, so I apologize in advance. Unless the change of registration is revoked within 10 days. Within 10 days of the change?
Yes,
Okay,
I'm making that change right now.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Got that. Okay. Go away. Now page 17. Okay. As per our discussion, I have provided that a complaint made against the Board of Ethics or a Board of Ethics member shall be investigated by the Board of Trustees without further detail. A complaint made regarding a violation of this code by the Board of Ethics or a member of the Board of Ethics shall be investigated by the Board of Trustees. The investigation and any hearing and the disposition of the complaint by the Board of Trustees shall be administered in accordance with the provisions of the Code of Ethics.
And Dan, can I just add one thing here? And,
Yes.
I think it's important we add this, that it will be investigated by the Board of Trustees or their designee. So it doesn't tie them to doing this, right? And I wouldn't want to create a scenario where they couldn't put the effort into this that's required just because they don't have the time or whatever reason. And so, if they choose somebody to do the investigation, I think that's important that we note that.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm fine with that, but I have kind of a different question. So if a complaint is made about the Board of Ethics or a member, and maybe this is, my other thing, more of a process than a code, how does that complaint get to the Board of Trustees? So if I'm filing a complaint about the Board of Ethics, following the current process, I'm filing it with the Board of Ethics.
And sorry, also promptly isn't defined anywhere. Like, what does promptly transmit a copy of the complaint mean? Like right away, within 10 days?
Where
Yep.
are you on that, Brian?
On E,
Sorry, in E. And then also in E, the last time it says board, where it says the board shall promptly transmit, I think it should say Board of Ethics, not just board, so we know who we're referring to.
All right. So we should define, nothing in this section shall be construed to permit the Ethics Board to conduct an investigation of itself or any of its members if the Ethics Board receives a complaint alleging that the Ethics board of any of its members have violated provision, the board shall promptly transmit a copy of the complaint to the Board of Trustees. So we should state that it should be within 72 hours or 5 days, something like that. I agree with you. I think it promptly should be defined.
100% agree. No, I wouldn't go more than 5 days.
I would do immediately. If they've received a written complaint, just forward it immediately. Why do
Well-
you need 5 days?
I
What if
think,
it's a holiday?
I don't need 5 days, but for me, it's a clearly established time frame. Maybe it's 3 days, it's 24 hours. I just want to put, the number of days in this.
I agree it needs to be clarified, but I don't see why it's not a
because I
upon
think,
receipt.
well, I think Ellen immediately is also like promptly.
Yeah.
Yes,
So I would say 48 hours because to account for
Like a holiday or something.
Saturdays, Sundays, holidays, religious observances, that sort of thing. 72 sounds better, but I think 48
All right.
contains the sense of urgency.
I'm fine with 48 hours.
Yeah, good spot on that, Brian. Now getting back to the question about there was another question in there. It had to do with
A designate by the
Designate.
Board of Trustees.
yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that there should be that authority.
Yep, I agree with that as well.
And at some point, we will take up Tom's very strong suggestion that there be provision for a hearing officer in lieu of the mayor having to sit as a hearing officer, but that's not for right now.
But in what Nora sent us earlier,
I didn't read it.
there was reference to a hearing officer.
Yeah. Okay, I haven't read that yet. Okay. All right, so I think we've clarified that. Anything else on this section? Good comments. I'm going now to, I'm actually going to go backwards now. I don't know why well, actually, let's go to let's go to number 6 on my notes. This is 21 14 on page 2114B. Civil fine. In its discretion and after a hearing providing for due process procedural mechanisms, the Ethics Board, pursuant to Section 2110, may assess a civil fine not to exceed $1,500 for each violation upon any VOM, officer, board member, et cetera, found by the board to have violated this chapter. The board shall conduct and complete the hearing with reasonable promptness. There we go again. The civil fine shall be payable to the Village of Mamaroneck. What do you think about $1,500? Should there be a COLA here? Should we increase it?
Well, one of my other questions, the who, do we need committee members here?
Yep, I think.
So we have an officer, board member, employee, or consultant, no committee members.
Okay, let me put that in. Well, I'm just going to plug it in now and I'll alphabetize everything. Later, and in fact, there's another question relating to this collection of defined people that I have.
All right, so in previous meetings, and Mike, I believe it was you who have
I think Ellen froze.
Ellen froze,
back?
I didn't catch.
All right, am I back?
You're back.
All right. So I believe Mike has questioned in the past, and maybe it's just relevant to certain sections. Does the fine itself really mean anything?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the more important aspect is that the conduct doesn't continue. And the question becomes is if the conduct doesn't continue because something has happened and it's in the past and it becomes discovered. So
That's kind of a slippery slope thing.
Could you rephrase that for me? I don't think I followed.
the way I see it is that for me, the goal should be that we always have ethical conduct and that when something is discovered, a monetary fine isn't going to say, okay, this isn't a problem anymore. We want the person to engage in proper ethical conduct. So they're removed, they're suspended, they're removed from the position where they can't engage in that conduct. The problem comes where something is discovered a year later, 8 months later, the matter has been closed or the item has been purchased, then there has to be some punishment there, is what I'm saying.
Well,
Right.
Isn't that where a fine comes in because if the person has departed office?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And that would be the fine, but I'm hung up with, like, I don't want this to be about fines. And that's why I said this a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, was that I think that the more important censure here is that the conduct stops. You know, they're removed from that position. The problem with my own statement there is what happens when conduct is discovered after the fact and the matter is closed. There's got to be some sort of discipline there, and that's possibly where the fine can come in.
Sorry, I was actually thinking about this recently. Like, is there like a statute of limitations for these things? Like, is someone gonna like make a complaint about something that happened like 10 years ago? So like if the person left office, especially if it's like a year later, I agree, like they should still be able to be fined. But if it was like 10 years ago, right, can you really do anything at that point?
That's a good question. I mean, there is a statute of limitations. Every state has a statute of limitations. I don't know, Brian, if it applies to administrative proceedings, but the statute of limitations well defines what an authority can prosecute criminally as a newly minted. You know, Brian, I recall being told that you never know more law than after you've taken the bar exam.
You
So
don't.
I'm going to ask you to because to see whether in New York State there is a statute. The statutes of limitation are applicable to civil proceedings of this kind.
Or I'll research that. Because I know in this code of ethics, I don't think it mentions anything like it.
Doesn't.
Or I'll research it.
Thank you. And a very good thought. I think the direction I thought you were going in, Mike, was whether the Board of Ethics can enjoin prohibited conduct, whether they can fine whether the board can say, you have to stop doing what you're doing. Or can bar somebody from future service for a period of time, can suspend them from membership on a committee, whether they have those remedies too.
I'm good with that, right? And that's what I brought up the first time, was the most important part of this should be is the conduct stops so that the process is as clean as possible. What I just realized in this conversation is, okay, what happens when something becomes discovered well after the fact, right?
Yeah.
It's too late to say you have to stop. And that's why now I've changed my position here and I offer that, yes, we do need to have a fine structure, but that needs to be for those things that are after the fact. So somebody can't thumb their nose, say, at the of disclosure and say, yeah, okay, give me the $500 fine. I don't care. I am still going to represent this person, or I'm still going to do this. That's my change.
Well, the other thing that I would change is we have not to exceed 1,500. Do we need a lower amount? Not to, a range, because we don't want it to be $1. That's not going to change anyone's behavior.
Well, I think the traditional language of penal statutes is to, well, I take that back. The statutes sometimes state the limit of a fine, and in some cases, they actually prescribe the fine. If you, littering is $250. I guess a board can lower it, but there is a specified fine. My own feeling is that I would leave it at a not to exceed. And my question is whether $1,500 is enough.
Stan, can I just offer, if we do that, right, it creates discretion. And then discretion can be interpreted, and I hate to say it, as favoritism or a lack of enforcement, harsh treatment. And so, where there is a defined amount, that's it. That's what the code calls for. And I think it takes the appearance out that an individual or individuals were favored or not favored.
Well, there'll always be that, but there'll always be mitigating circumstances too. So somebody could have violated the code of ethics, but in such a benign way as to call for some act of mercy or consideration. So I'm more in favor of, I think we have to trust our members, particularly on a board of ethics, not to show favoritism and to come to some agreement on what's fair.
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think 1,500 is fine.
You think that's enough?
I don't think it is enough. I hear what you're saying. And again, I'm trying to be consistent. I like it where everything is established, and I understand that, we need discretion here, but I think that's where a lot of the problems come from. And I think that when the rules are clearly established and violations are identified and, the punishments are identified, I think it makes it a lot cleaner. Now, I'm not, I don't want to hold this up and continue it much more, but it's just my feeling. I'm trying to be consistent. I'm sorry.
I agree with Mike on that. And I think if John were on the phone, he would also say that it shouldn't be something discretionary because he's referred to things being too political and stuff in the past. So I think it should be a specified amount. However, having said that, I also think it depends on what the violation is.
Remember, we have striven to create an impartial board here, making sure that politically it is balanced and we are choosing citizens for an ethics board. I would like to think that an ethics board is really not going to be political by design. And I go back to, I served during non-COVID times. I am a small claims court arbitrator and did it for many years in New York. And we have very, very broad discretion, and there are so many facets of every case that we can assess. Well, not so many we can not fines, but we settle cases with a lot of discretion. And I just think that given that it is the Board of Ethics, that they should have discretion.
Yeah, I think so too, especially like each violation is different, like there are different facts. Like some violations are way more egregious than others. That's just a way of life.
All right, let's think about that. We'll table that for now, but I think we come away from this discussion with some good ideas about other, I'll look at the code again. I don't think it's addressed, but we should come away with some ideas about other sanctions that the Board of Ethics can impose, short of or in addition to the fine. So that's good. Okay.
Dan,
Yes.
if I can, I had a 7 hard stop that I have to drop now, and I apologize to the rest of the
That's
group.
fine, Mike. I was given that we don't have, I don't know if we have Jocelyn still.
No, she dropped off.
All right, so we're going to lose
And
our,
Mike, you're late for your 7.
and John is not on. So I think this is a good time to stop, because then there's a whole different section on definitions that I want to go to next, and we'll do that. We've done a lot. We've accomplished a lot during this hour, so thank you all for that. With that in mind, is there anything that we should urgently bring up at this meeting? If not, I'm going to entertain a motion to, I love that expression, entertain.
Before
Sorry.
you entertain,
Yeah.
can put on the next agenda, because it's missing, the annual distribution of the Code of Ethics. So I got the thing through the village's system that I had to do this. There is no time frame in the code.
Or for distribution?
No, so they distributed it in January, and you have to go online and read it and sign and whatever, which is fine, but there's no timeline.
Or compliance?
Yep.
All right, I will put that on the agenda.
And
So
sorry,
we need to agree to that.
Brian,
ahead.
yeah, sorry. One thing about the February 11 minutes, I just realized I shouldn't have had on the first page from the public Mark Ettinger at the meeting, because I copy and paste from my old minutes. I use the template.
I saw that, but I wasn't sure if you meant that he was on via Zoom or something.
No, I'm sorry about that.
Can anybody tell whether we have anybody else visiting this meeting tonight?
Yeah,
Yes.
we do.
Yeah.
We have V4 as an attendee,
Okay,
so he's watching like any member of the public would be.
well, that's great. I love having people attend our meeting.
Yeah.
And then view full attendee list. You'll see who's there.
Yeah, that's how I get the attendee list for the minutes.
Is that something I can do from here?
Yeah, you have
Yeah.
to click
Go to
participant.
participants. Click on participants at the bottom. And then you'll see panelists and attendees. There's 2 toggles at the top.
Let's see. Well, I'm not going to hold you guys up. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second? I second. All in favors? Aye.
Aye.
Very productive meeting. Thank you all so much. And I'll be in touch with you. I'll reply to Mr. Jasinski, and we'll meet next week. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks.
Thank you.